This is our first virtual newsroom visit, hosted by our good friends at the Christian Science Monitor. I'm Jackie Park. I'm the Head of Network Strategy and Innovation for IPI. And as the network of the world's journalists, editors and publishers, IPI came out of 2020 busy, as our World Congress tagline said, reimagining journalism with 2020 vision. And I think, for all of us, 2020 and the pandemic has felt like a pivot year for journalism, a time to pause and kind of understand, just where we're at. And we are deep into the process of rebuilding the industry for the 21st century. And I think, we at IPI, our global network, and I'm sure all of you, are doing it with an enduring certainty of the journalistic mission. Perhaps a little less certainty in how we make it all work. We keep listening and watching and experimenting and testing our way to the future. One thing that we do know is that journalism, media, it works best as a network where we support, share and challenge each other. Not just in one town or one country, but across continents and around the world. And we know we have tremendous smarts in the IPI Global Network. And we also have a solidarity that really wants to, lift all boats. And so I guess with that, this is really where we are right now with our virtual visits. We're aiming to level up media's understanding and learn from each other and, to spark new ideas. Now, today we're visiting the Monitor. And it's really your chance to, I guess, cherry pick the, lessons and ideas from, their wonderful experience that they're going to share with us today. The Monitor has always been different. Well, to me, it's always felt different. And it's always had lessons for the industry. It's the oldest US-based international non-profit news organisation. It was, I think, the first, or certainly one of the first, to go digital first in 2009. And it's, really deep into an audience-centred focus. And the result right now is thoughtful global coverage daily online and weekly in a print magazine. Its journalism has been based on one big question, which is how can journalism fuel human progress? And, I think, for me, that's a profoundly hopeful perspective that the Monitor has been bringing to its audiences for 113 years. And, I really want to thank and introduce at the same time our hosts. We have Amelia Newcomb, who's the managing editor. Amelia.
Hi.
Hi. It's sometimes hard to find the screen. Great, there you are. Mark Sappenfield is the editor. Yeah, hi Mark. Clay Collins is Director of Editorial Innovation. And Dave Scott is the Audience Engagement Editor. And so it's great to have all of you here. Thank you so much for joining this meeting. And in a moment, I'm going to throw to Amelia to kick off. But just some I guess housekeeping. How will we run this? So it's great to see you all. Thanks for having your videos on and your audio off. We have kept this intentionally small so we can actually really have a conversation. We're going to start by with Amelia, Dave, Clay, and Mark, sort of presenting the different aspects of the Monitor and the lessons and experience that they're sharing. And we'll take about 20 minutes to do that, and to do that to kind of set the table, if you like, for the conversation. And then it's really up to you guys to take it, where you would like to, with your interests. And I'd suggest that you do that by, when we get to the conversation, by using, raise your hand, which is in the reactions box at the bottom. So if you raise your hand, ask a question, maybe, you can, keep the comments brief, but, can also share, from your perspective, what you would like. And yeah, that's pretty much how we'll run it. So, okay, with that, over to you, Amelia.
Thanks. Just a quick question. Did you want to show that video before I talk or after?
Yeah, let's do that. Let's do that, Melissa. So we just have a very short video, which I guess, is an intro to the monitor.
At the Christian Science Monitor, we think it's time to rethink the news.
Frankly, so much of what happens in news enters the spin cycle of social media.
Overlooked in the flood of daily news headlines.
Rather than getting into the day-to-day churn of the news, the froth.
Forms of conventional wisdom that don't really have any basis in fact.
People need to challenge themselves to see what's really going on.
News is essential. News is the fuel for a thriving democracy. It protects our rights and our values. It takes us to people and to places that we've never seen. But what happens if the news becomes something else? What happens if it becomes just a place to vent? What happens if it doesn't value our differences, but instead it plays on them to divide us even more? What happens when it preys on our fears because that's the best way to get us to click? What happens when news ignores the best of us, only to dwell on the worst? News is about so much more than facts. News is the story of us. It's the story of our struggle for dignity, for justice, for fairness, for compassion, for progress. That path is rarely straight or easy, but news is the story of how we, day after day and year after year, do the best we can to make our homes and our communities and our world better. This is how we want to deliver on that promise. We don't want to just be another news publication that's giving you that day's headlines. We want to add perspective.
Addressing the why of what happened as opposed to the what. Your inbox is filled with what.
We want to answer the question, why does this matter?
You just had this sense of a moment that encapsulated so much.
And on stories that you've already heard before, we want to add perspective so you can connect those dots even better.
Our approach to that story would be, how do we understand the world as it looks from their perspective?
And we want to meet you where you are. Whether that's 5 minutes or an hour that you have to spend each day, we are going to give you the whole story. The Monitor needs everyone who's tired of news that underestimates who we are. This is about nothing less than a revolution. The Monitor believes that each one of us can be a force for good, not a part of the problem. And we hope that you'll join us.
All right, well, thank you. That's just to explain, that was a video that we created about 5 years ago when we launched the Monitor Daily, which you'll hear more about as we go forward. And I have to say, looking at it again, it certainly was raising a lot of issues that were already present, but I think have gotten ever more intense and challenged us more in our news coverage as we've gone through the past 5 years. So I just thought I'd run through a little bit of the Monitor's history. You may be familiar with it, but in case you're not, I thought it might be helpful and just give you a sense of where we are around the world as well. And then we'll start talking about the kind of journalism we aspire to do. We're based in Boston, Massachusetts in the United States. And while we were founded in 1908 by a woman named Mary Baker Eddy, and she founded the Monitor with the purpose really of trying to challenge the kind of journalism that was often prevalent during her day. She was a prominent figure as the founder of the Christian Science Church, and she came in for a lot of scurrilous coverage, things that weren't true, a lot of things that sound familiar to us today. And I think that helped her feel that there was a better way to approach the media. And so we were a bit countercultural at the time and probably are a little bit today. But anyway, she started the paper. We're now 100 and 12, 13 years old. And we are a global newspaper. We have 6 bureaus around the United States, but we also have about 10 to 12 bureaus around the world. We have correspondents based in South Africa, Nigeria, France, the UK, the Middle East, China, although we're not there right now because of the pandemic, Russia, Mexico, Germany, Canada, and we have freelancers who support us in other countries as well. We really try to take a global outlook, as you saw mentioned in the video. We are an American-based newspaper, so maybe sometimes we fall a little bit short of that, but our aspiration is really to try to not look at the news from an American interests perspective, but to really prioritize what's important in other parts of the world and look at it from their perspective. Over the years, we've won 7 Pulitzers, some Overseas Press Club awards. Yesterday, we were awarded a citation for our coverage of fighting the Ebola epidemic in Eastern Congo. And that story really spoke to the kind of values that we have. The story was about an anthropologist who has really devoted herself to fighting distrust, because as we all know, and we see it currently in the pandemic, suspicion of motives, of worries from past history have keep people from engaging in steps that may be helpful toward moving their society forward. And so it was about fighting the pandemic by healing the distrust and looking at that core value that is so essential to society's progress. So that's kind of a very small snapshot, and I'll hand it over to Mark to share a little bit more about what we do. I think really for me, the key thing is that, as the video you saw said, we look for progress. We are, if you wanted to shorthand it, we're focused on solutions journalism. But what we really want to convey is that it's possible to have that outlook while being credible, while having our feet on the ground. We're not trying to look for solutions where they don't exist yet, but we are looking for the people that we all know we can find every day who are devoting themselves to improving a situation, to creating paths forward, to researching things so that we can find new points of progress or paths to progress. And so that's where we're all coming from. And, I'm just really very pleased to be here and to have such an international audience. And we would always love to hear from you about how we're doing. So Mark, over to you.
Thanks, Amelia. And I just want to underline what she was talking about in terms of, I wanted to talk about our mission and how we're trying to accomplish that and why that's, I think, relevant to the broader journalism world. Amelia put it perfectly in the sense that our founder, Mrs. Eddy, did not found us just to tell the news. She did not found us just to be an information source. She founded us because she felt like journalism can play an essential role in human progress. And I think Jackie said the same thing. And I think we would all agree with that. And I think what the Monitor has really wrestled with is that, that shouldn't be a byproduct, at least for the Monitor, that shouldn't be a byproduct of the work that we do. That should be the animating purpose of the work we do. And I think the Monitor has made a contribution to journalism in really exploring those frontiers. What is the journalism that brings progress? What is the journalism that brings healing? And I think what we run into is that, I think it's not unique to the United States, but sometimes the best journalism is not the journalism that readers or the most readers find the most relevant or the most urgent, because it involves nuance, or because it doesn't play on the things that we talked about in the video, the fear, the tensions. So often we see that journalism drives because people are scared of something, or because it's playing off this group, this is versus this group, and it's all in the tension. And that certainly is true, but that's not necessarily where the progress comes from. That's not where the forward steps come from. So how do you take journalism that does that and make it urgent and relevant to readers? And I think that's what we are I would say we're a really good laboratory for trying to figure that out, and that is a ongoing thing. I would say that we haven't figured out the formula yet, but we're still here, and we're still trying, and we're still moving forward, and we are finding things. And I would say in our latest iteration in trying to figure that out, I would distill what we try and do down to 4 things, and this is what we've tried to be consistent about in talking through the organization, and that in itself is a challenge because, especially in this moment in journalism, you're always evolving to try and figure out what you can do to be successful. But how do you make journalism of progress relevant and urgent? And I would say for us right now, I would say hope, I would say humanity, I would say perspectives, and I would say ideas. And I think when you take those together, again, this is an evolving list, but when you take those together, you see what the seeds of progress are. Hope is where humanity is making strides forward, and those need to be chronicled because that's a part of what we do. And if we only chronicle the bad, then we're only giving people half a view of the world. Humanity are the qualities that draw us all together and that bring out the best of us. That also, I would say, is an element of quality. That's where human rights comes from. It's that shared humanity that, no matter where we are, everyone on this call can say, we share those qualities. Ideas are when we get beyond just kind of the nitty gritty into to the larger sense of how we can attack problems. And then the perspectives is how we understand one another, which we see specifically in the United States is such an issue, whether it's Republican, Democrat, whether it's white and black. Perspectives is the ability for us, as Dave said in that call, in that video, is to be able to see out from the other person's eyes, which I think is also an essential element of progress, because if you're constantly just going at one another, you're never going to find the mutual space to move together forward. So we're really trying to focus our journalism on those qualities because we think that's where we can both fulfill our mission and hopefully present a really compelling narrative to readers. I didn't know, Clay, if you wanted to go next or Dave, but however you wanted to go it, just jump on in.
I could start in on product if you like. I'm sort of I'm the editorial side's product person. So I tend to be around the ground floor of new launches. I worked on the launch of the weekly magazine, which was the print arm that we kept going after we closed the print daily newspaper, and I was its editor for the first 8 years. And then more recently, I helped us develop the digital daily. So, I mean, our product arc is kind of interesting, and I can just say a few words about how we did the development of the daily, which is kind of our most recent story, and then we can just move on. Dave can talk some, and then I can answer questions, and we all can. So we were publishing online, sort of doing the SEO thing, and we had the vestigial print publication in the weekly, and the thinking was that we should have some sort of digital product. We had at the time something called the Daily News Briefing, which was basically a PDF that was emailed to subscribers, and we wanted to see if we could do something a little more engaging and interesting. So we launched into a series of design sprints, which is an iterative time-boxed exercise developed by Google for product development. And there's a lot of user testing, and we spend a great deal of time sort of surveying the landscape and seeing what we might borrow or steal, what we might do that's new, and a really interesting period of time. We went into it with kind of no preconceptions about what the product would look like. It was going to be digital, and that's virtually all we knew. So the general thinking in the room was, what does the monitor do? And one of the things that we do is we kind of intercept erroneous narratives in the news, and we sort of add some course correction or some perspective. You heard a lot about that in the video just now. So interestingly, along the way, we spun off another little mini product called the Redirect. There are a couple videos that I think Jackie can throw in the chat for later. And those were just sort of aimed at kind of prevailing narratives that were inaccurate. We did one on Islamophobia around the time when that was raging, and kind of presented a lot of counterfacts. For example, that the number of the forces arrayed in the fight against ISIS were predominantly Muslim, which was surprising for a lot of Americans. but the redirect was ended up kind of being one piece of what we wanted to do, the kind of the counter narrative piece. And we wanted to go broader than that. So again, through iterative testing and talking to users and potential users in Zoom user tests, we came up with a few kind of features that remain to this day that have been pretty successful. One is a kind of almost call and response approach where you have one editor who is basically the host editor of the daily, setting up the package with an introduction on the day's news, and then kind of before each story, giving a quick explanation of why we wrote this. It's basically the why we wrote this, sometimes slightly rewritten to be more transitional. And then our other very popular feature was we had noticed, I think it was the Washington Post had done a collapsible story at one point. So we developed, one of our in-house developers came up with a toggle so that we could do what we call a mini read, which is about 220 words, and then a toggle to a full read. That's been really popular with subscribers. So yeah, we've just pushed on that. We converted most of the people who were getting that PDF daily news briefing did convert to the new daily, and the circulation has sort of stayed about where it was. We now bundle the subscription with a subscription to the digital weekly. So that's an option. The weekly, I think, has around 25,000 plus subscribers at the moment, and the daily has about 10,000. So that's sort of where we are in terms of product at the moment. I can, Dave, if you'd like to jump in and talk about some of the other things we're doing as far as customer outreach.
Sure. One of the current initiatives is to reach out to groups through Zoom events. Over the last little over a year, or 6 months to a year, we've been holding Zoom events every month or every 2 months. The most recent one was just last week, where we had it was built on a story that we'd done. We'd profiled a teenager in India who is starting community library. She's 19 years old, Muslim student, very active in the anti-citizenship movement, but she was also doing this in her own community where she was starting a library, and she's since expanded to more than one library. So we featured her in an event, and this event is, the format generally is, we have a 30-minute interview between, in this case, between Mark and the student, and then we have 30 minutes of Q&A with the audience. And the purpose of this is just to build a relationship with subscribers and to engage with them, to let them get to know us and how we approach things and how we approach the news. And in this case, to get to know somebody who we profiled. We've done various versions of this. Mostly it's been us talking with our staff, and an editor talking with staff and featuring a story that we've done. Another event was about healing racial justice. In January, we did that, which was focused on a 3-part audio series we'd done on what's called Black Wall Street, which was a part of Tulsa, Oklahoma, where there was a massacre 100 years ago. And this was a story about how they've gone through that healing and that process of reconciliation. And it's still a work in progress, obviously, but it also resonates in sort of a larger scale with the rest of the United States and the world and the issues there. And each time we do one of these events, we're testing things. Like in this last event, we tested inviting with a video. We used a video as part of the invitation process, and we actually got 800 views of that video. We did a post-event chat, which was, we ended the event very similar to this. We ended the event and then let the audience stay on for the next half hour and chat among themselves to see if that would be, see if they had ideas about the topic of creating libraries. And what it turned out was over 100 people stayed on and talked with each other and actually sort of sang the praises of the event, which was nice to see. We tested invited university students by using Facebook to see if that worked. We invited non-subscribers, people who get our free newsletters, to this event. Normally it's subscribers, but in this case it was non-subscribers. And this was the first time we actually had just the editor and a single guest having a conversation, and that turned out quite well. And we tried various things in terms of in the invitation process. We tried different email subject lines to see which would work better. And we found one that worked best and used that. And we managed to boost our attendance by using the different email subject lines. Kind of the point is that we're continuing to iterate. That design sprint process that Clay talked about has become something that's sort of built into what we do. We're constantly testing and trying new things. We have to, and trying to see what works. So happy to share more on that later if you have questions. And I'll post a link into this. We have a community page where we collect all of these events that once the event is over, we have a video version that we can send out to people after the event and people can see it. So I'm just going to put a link there in the chat so you can see a link to that event page.
Dave mentioned audio. We haven't done anything close to a full pivot, but we are emphasizing audio now because we have found with early experimentation that it is very successful at connecting people with stories. So the Tulsa series, for instance, that Dave just mentioned was a 3-part podcast reported by 2 of our writers there, and it's based on the 100th anniversary of the Black Wall Street massacre, which actually was in late May. But we did it early. We're going to resurface it then. But we've got a few sort of franchise podcasts now that represent different areas. We've got one that just carries basically a text to audio type podcast that carries the daily, but we also have one called Perception Gaps, which we've had 2 seasons so far. And that's one that looks at sort of along the lines of the redirect. Actually, it looks at the gap between what's, what people think they know and what actually is. And then we've got a sort of catch-all podcast called Rethinking the News that essentially was built to be a home for everything we do that's audio first. And we're very conscious of the fact that most good audio is narrative audio and is designed as audio and conceived as audio. So we're trying to do more thinking. When we start talking about stories, an early question that we try to ask now is, what's the best way to tell this story? It isn't always a 12 to 1500 word written piece. Sometimes it's, let's send writers to do some enterprise audio. And we've got a couple more big series in the pipeline now. So that's been pretty exciting and kind of is our current enterprise area in presentation.
Okay, thanks, Clay. Does anyone want to pick up the conversation? Have any questions? I mean, I certainly have a couple to keep us going for a while. So, Amelia, you talked in our pre-chat. You talked about getting to stability, like sort of how you got there and what that has meant for the organisation. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure. The Monitor is, like many media outlets around the world, has faced its challenges, both in terms of subscribers and revenue and all that kind of thing. We are a nonprofit. But when we went, as Clay mentioned, we had a print daily, which was increasingly challenging for us. We were online, of course, as soon as everybody else went online. We had our print daily, but it was distributed through the mail. And so, for readers, often it would get there late and so forth. So in 2009, we went online first and did a lot of work very successfully in the beginning to attract a broad readership to the site. But often, as is often the case, people come and go. They don't necessarily, you're not sticking with us as sort of part of a community. And that's really what the daily's been all about. So that started in 2016. Our print weekly that Clay mentioned also has gone right along. That's what we went to in 2009 as our print version, as Clay said. Very loyal readership, which is great. And that's what we're trying to do with the daily as well, and to really engage people more. And as we did that, we had been through various staff cuts, trying to trim our budget and everything. And our revenue comes from subscriptions. We have an endowment as well. And we do get extra support, because we are not break even yet, from the Christian Science Church, which publishes us. And so we agreed on a staff size that would we could count on, and basically on a budget, which sounds all very normal, but it removed the immediate pressure that we felt every year of, oh, we're not hitting our budget target, we're going to get further cuts and everything. And I think it gave everybody a chance to kind of breathe a little more easily. We became a staff of 50 full-time people and at least 10 to 15 others who are on major contracts with us. So we're actually a fairly small staff for the kind of output and global reach that we have. But then we work within a set budget, which has worked out pretty well. So that stability and a lot of support from our publisher has allowed us to be a little bit more experimental. But just knowing the parameters a little bit more clearly was, I think, very helpful to our ability to to go forward. So yeah.
Yeah, great. Emery, did you have a question?
Yeah, yes. As I've written, it's actually for all speakers, but mostly as a journalist, I'm interested in the journalistic part, but at the same time, I'm really involved in products, etc. related areas, so others are also welcome. As both types of media organizations usually have similar content strategy, products, audiences, and business models, what do you think is the primary factor that differentiates a non-profit newsroom from a for-profit one? What are the disadvantages and advantages of being a non-profit newsroom?
Mark, is that something you'd like to?
I've never worked at a for-profit paper, so others, if there's anyone here who has, they should probably jump in. But my sense is from talking to other people who I know, just colleagues who work there, the pressures are very different. Obviously, the for-profit newsroom, I mean, this goes without saying, but the for-profit newsroom has to make money or else it doesn't exist. So that means that there are certain pressures that if you do not make it work, then you can't be. And so that just in all the ways that we know is that there are certain kinds of journalism that we know we can put them out there and we will get people to engage with them. But are those the kinds of journalism that actually are meaningful? Are those the kinds of journalism that are rewarding for the reader or for the writer? So I think to me, the for-profit, the nonprofit generally, if it's run well, if it's run the right way, if it has financial backing behind it, it gives you a space to have a little bit more freedom to do the journalism that you think is necessary and to carve out a niche for yourself. Not that you can't, clearly, I mean, everyone is carving out a niche no matter where they are in for-profit or nonprofit. But I think with nonprofit, you have a little bit more freedom to think openly about what do we want to be, what do we think is needed, and come at it from that way. Whereas if you're a for-profit, you kind of just have to say, what's the niche in the marketplace? And it's kind of which comes first, the journalism or the profit motive? And obviously there are ways of combining those two, so you can do both. So it's not all for-profit are just doing things that are just profitable and not of value. Of course not. But I do think in nonprofit, you have a little more space to really think about what you think journalism needs to be doing.
Yeah, and I would just add to that is the Monitor has always been about its journalistic mission. I've been at the Monitor quite a long time now, over 30 years. If you talk to people in the newsroom or around on our staff around the world, people have a pretty clear idea, as they should, but it's very clear that people are on pretty much the same page of what we're trying to do. But one thing we've really tried to do in the past several years is lean in on making sure readers understand what our mission is. And the reason I mention that is that it goes to the nonprofit model is, if it is about the journalism, it's about the idea, and you have to make that really explicit to readers. But one thing we found is that, you can think, wow, this story just screams our mission and our purpose and our approach. And then you ask a reader about it and they're going, oh, no, I did. And once you mention it, they'll say, oh, yeah, I see that. But they don't, it's not clear. And So in terms of really making sure that, as a nonprofit outlet, we are really explicit about that mission, I think it's pushing us more in that direction, which is good, just to take what we feel and communicate it much more effectively to readers.
You're muted, Jackie.
Dave, one of the, I think, going online obviously opens up, access to new audiences. Did you, and sometimes has its own tensions, I guess, between, the sort of print audience and the new audiences that you have online. Did you find that, like, who is your audience? How do you find them online? Are they different to the audience that you had in print? And how do you reconcile that? How does that work?
Some of our research has shown that our print audience is a little less engaged in the digital, but what we found is when we actually looked closely at our print audiences, they were actually digital readers as well. That they often looked at the print product as a place to lean back and relax and read, that the rest of their life is full of digital engagement. And so they looked at a print product as an opportunity to back off from that, to still read and read the kind of journalism, but to have more of a slow read, to have more of a quiet space to think and ponder. So it wasn't that they were digital Luddites, that they weren't engaged in the digital world, but that fact they were very engaged in the digital world often, but they saw the print as an opportunity to step away from that a little bit and still engage in journalism. So that's one of the things we found out just in talking to them and interviewing them and trying to figure out what that audience really wanted. Is that getting at what you're looking for, Jackie? Is that answering your question? You're muted, sorry. I can't hear you.
Sorry. Yes, partly. And of course, that then kind of opens up the question to, well, how do you think about serving those audiences differently? But I guess the other part of the question is how do you think about building your audience online? Because you're thinking globally. Are you thinking psychographically, or how do you find your people?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. And one of the things we've gone through as an exercise where we've actually developed 5 different personas. These are people that we know are subscribers to us. For example, one of them we have named Compassionate Kathy. This is somebody who's who's a humanitarian, who's engaged in the world, who reads the Monitor, who's not a Christian Scientist, but she does have faith or a moral base to what she does and what activates her and gets her engaged in the world and gets her out in the world. We have another profile we call Independent Ians. These are news junkies who are very, they want to hear all sides, and they look to the Monitor to say, give me a different perspective, help me think through the various issues, but don't tell me what to think. So we have these different personas, and we know that they exist because we've interviewed them, we've talked to them, we looked at all of our subscribers, we've had conversations with these people. And so we've shared this with the staff as they think about who is our audience and how do we reach out to them and meet their needs.
All right, so we have a few questions, and so Nigel, do you want to ask the question yourself, or? So Nigel is from 263 Chat in Zimbabwe, and he's asked, how has COVID affected your overall operations? And I guess I would add to that, is there a lesson you can share out of that?
Yeah.
What you've learned about how you will work or your audience or da-da-da. So and then there's a couple of more questions, but let's go one at a time. And if anyone wants to actually ask a question, just pop your hand up and let's hear from you.
Yeah, thanks for it, Jackie. Thank you very much. Yeah, just how has COVID affected the operation? Both your subscribers, your audience, and also the team. Remote working and all that sort of stuff. Keeping people's morale high or normal. How's that all going?
Well, I can take a stab at that and then others can join in as well. I mean, it's been very challenging. I think we're probably like some other organizations that I'm just so impressed by our staff and how well everybody's done in adapting. You know, I actually happened to be in our office today. We're still pretty much remote, but I came in and, you know, the calendars are still set at last March of 2020. And it's, you know, we've all had these experiences. But what we've done is we started definitely with the viewpoint and communicating clearly to staff that we didn't want them to do anything that was uncomfortable. And we also wanted to be law abiding and, you know, obviously operate by the dictates of whatever country people were in, and to be, you know, adhere to all the protocols that we know about from the past year. People got really innovative. They would sometimes, unless it was an absolute complete lockdown moment, they would report locally, being careful, or they would do, our correspondents have usually in their work traveled quite a bit. So they would do phone interviews with, you know, people that they normally would have gone to see. They worked with freelancers who were on the ground, who were willing to, you know, go out and get some local color for them. And, you know, we had people doing some really innovative things. In one story, we had a writer who, it was actually in the United States, but his lead was so colorful. I was reading it before it was published. I asked the editor, I said, did he go there? And he turned out, no, he'd gotten on Google Earth. And it was actually about antebellum plantation tours and how much they've changed because of Black Lives Matter. And he'd gotten on Google Earth and literally gone through a tour with this person who was offering tours of the, not the big houses, they used to say, of these plantations, which used to be the focus, but the quarters of enslaved people and so forth and so on. And so, you know, we were very upfront about that in the story, but he was able to give a real sense of place. It was also in a state where he had lived. So, so he had some familiarity of his own. But anyway, through doing things like that and working as teams, correspondents teaming up, I feel like we've been able to stay on top of things pretty well. It's obviously been far less travel, you know, than we're used to, but people have been innovative. And I think partly by working as teams, by doing, you know, team discussions or just group or what we call Fun Fridays on Zoom, we can keep people's morale up and, you know, try to do everything we can. You know, I think like everybody else, it's wearing on people a little bit at this point, but we do try to both be innovative in the work, travel as is possible, work as teams, and also frankly try to convey a sense, you know, all the different aspects. There's so much to cover in this, and I think when you do the coverage that people can see themselves in, they can hear other people voicing what they're thinking about, it makes a big difference. I'd say that's what we've done. One thing I'll just add, and we should probably put this link in the chat, is our correspondent who's based in Johannesburg wanted to do a look at how 21-year-olds were feeling about turning 21 in 2021 when there was a pandemic going on. And it was a huge staff effort. It was an innovative project for us. We do a lot of collaborative reporting, but we had never done something at this scale. And we did stories, like one big reported story that was the cover of our magazine, but also focused in on 12 21-year-olds around the world who kind of did these, what we called as told to stories. So it was really trying to let their voice come through. And it was a very challenging, but I think ultimately also quite satisfying project for everybody, because it had so much humanity to it. And it was such a, gave voice to the rising generation around the world who's being shaped so profoundly by the pandemic.
What a great idea. Tom, do you want me to take the question out of the box, or would you like to ask?
Sure, I will ask. Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here and giving us this opportunity to learn about the Monitor. I just was curious, what are some of the stories you're really super proud of? I know you've mentioned a few already, but what are some of the stories that sort of exemplify the mission of the Monitor and sort of helping us to share our hopes and our concerns and our common humanity?
And actually, I should just say, like, I mean, if you could just say where you're from as well. Tom?
Sure, I'm actually from Cambridge, Massachusetts, just across the river. But my wife and I have lived in Singapore since the fall of 2012.
Okay, great.
Mark, do you want to?
The two stories that immediately come to mind for me are, there was one that I think it was Clay mentioned earlier, is there was a race massacre in the United States in 1920, I believe it was. It was in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And obviously we're coming up on 100 years on that. And there's also been some news around that, in that the city largely has just ignored that for the past 100 years, but recently has begun to wrestle with the legacy of that. And we did a 3-part audio series on that. And the third part in particular was about the strength and vitality of the Black community that has emerged in Tulsa. That to me was an amazing story of resilience and hope. And also just about how do you heal, and the need to go back, and you can't just paper over things. You can't just say that was in the past. There's no one alive who did that. You have to reckon with the past, or else you can't move on from the past. I thought that was just really beautifully done. That might have been the only time that I actually cried during a Monitor story. It was beautiful. The other one was, some of you will be aware that in all the racial tensions that have been going on in the United States, there was an incident that happened in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And we sent 2 of our writers there. And what I loved about that story was its nuance. Is I think one of the great tendencies in journalism today is to try to fit things into easy narratives. But I think my sense is doing that only widens divides, because then people start buying into narratives as opposed to wrestling with the fact that things are not black or white, they're gray so often. And there's a need to recognize that not one side has it all right. Even when there's a predominance, that everyone has someone to bring to the conversation. And I felt like that story not only brought out the humanity of Kenosha in a way that was really powerful and that I didn't see in other places, but also it wrestled with these gray areas where these are really difficult conversations. And there's a very understandable reason right now to try and go with certain narratives, because America has a lot of racial reckoning to do. We need to still make a ton of progress, but yet the conversation is still nuanced, and it's important to keep those nuances, because that's actually how you find solutions.
Okay. Bill, you have a follow-up question on audience.
Yes, good morning, everyone. And I joined late, so if this question has already been addressed, please just move on. I'm Bill Mitchell. I'm the relatively new publisher of the National Catholic Reporter, which is a progressive, independent weekly addressing issues of interest to Catholics. And one of our main struggles is the age of our readership. We publish every other week in print, with printing about 21,000 print copies spread pretty broadly across the US, very little overseas print readership. And online, we're doing something over maybe 1.2 million or 1.3 million unique visitors a week. So much bigger audience online. But the print audience, the average age, brace yourselves, is around 80. Largely Vatican II Catholics who looked to reform the church in the 60s and have been hanging in there. Online, the readership is probably averaging in the 50s, so quite a bit younger. But one of the key issues that we're addressing in terms of surviving and thriving in the long term is how to move our readership younger, while at the same time we serve the older readers, because they're among our major donors. We're also a nonprofit and rely on fundraising as actually our leading source of revenue. So I'm interested in how you're dealing with aging readerships, and if you know demographics and are comfortable sharing them, I'd be interested in those.
Yeah, I think Dave and Clay would have a lot to say on that, but I think it's I'll try. I'd love to answer that question, although Dave and Clay might have more specifics than me because that's a core question for us. And I would say, just from my perspective, is that the Monitor is dealing with those same demographic forces, which is the secularization of America, generally slowly. We actually have a story coming out where I think for the first time is, Amelia, you might know this, is it a Pew survey? I don't know, it's a survey, but for the first time, you don't have 50% of people saying that they are religious or Christian. I forget what it is, but there's some threshold that's been passed that shows this rise in what we've called in America, the rise of the nones, being N-O-N-E-S, meaning when you ask them, what religion do you follow? They say none. Doesn't mean they're not spiritual. It just means they're not following organized religion. And
Right.
I've looked at the Monitor's size and its profitability, and it directly tracks the size of the movement, the Christian Science movement. And that's not to say, generally half of our readers are non-Christian scientists, so it doesn't mean that we are entirely dependent on Christian scientists by any means, but they certainly are the core of our readership and in some ways the engine of what we do. And we're seeing the exact same trends as you are. Our readership is skewing older. I would say we haven't figured it out yet. My sense is that serving those older readers and serving younger readers is almost, to be, again, I'd love for Dave and Clay to jump in, but almost impossible, because I think they want radically different things from the news and news presentation. I think the way that you reach a 70 or 60-year-old news consumer is radically different from how you reach a 20 or 30-year-old consumer. And I think for us, the way I'm thinking about it right now is that we have brand awareness among people who are over 50. So let's see if we can make progress there in terms of growing. And then when we are required, we're just going to have to take a hard switch over, because my sense is that the way that we're doing news right now is not really optimized for younger people. But if we wanted to do that, it would we'd have to make very large changes in what we do, and institutionally that can be fairly traumatic. So it's really just trying to balance this point of how long can we stick with the audience we have, and when are we going to have to switch over? And when we do that, we're going to need to make some big changes.
I mean, we're starting to parse individual projects now in different ways, and one of them is audience appeal. So for instance, we just did a little 6-part podcast called It's About Time. And that's what it's about, the human construct and all the ways that it affects our lives and how we can get a handle on it. That was anchored by 2 20-something staffers. It's got a lot of energy. The podcast world is one place we think we can go. The challenge, of course, we like to think that we have a lens that kind of transcends traditional age demographics, and that if we can bring people across, if something like that can appeal to them, and then we can bring them in, and what we offer at the Wellspring is something that transcends traditional audience demographics, that's a way we can do it. And telegraphing distinction, I think that came up earlier. Amelia sort of hinted at the challenge we have, because what we do is pretty nuanced. And so, if you like, we can talk a little bit more about that too. Once you get people into your content, we've taken a hard look at the SEO audience and how we can use that, why we wrote this box, to better telegraph who we are and get them to stick around. And we found that just by repositioning it, putting it a little bit further into the story instead of at the very top, because it's not written like a summary. The idea really is to stop someone as they're reading the story and say, you may think you know what the story is, you may have heard it, but we're bringing something really different to it. So we found in another design sprint more recently that moving it down a few paragraphs and backing it with a hotter color actually got people to stop, consider what they were reading, have a light go on about the difference, and then finish. And in one user test in particular, just a really quick anecdote, we had a story about how police officers, the challenge of being a cop in settings where First Amendment free speech rights and Second Amendment right to carry were sort of in churn, and the dangers there and the perils of that. And we had a test user going through the story she hit our why we wrote this, which was kind of, it talked about, you know, what underpinned that, the real shifts and the special challenges. And she actually stopped and read it and volunteered that she had thought going in that this was going to be a story with a kind of, you know, politically right take on the challenges of policing. And after she read the nuance in the why, I can't remember exactly what it was, she said that she felt that she was willing now to finish the story because she felt it was bringing her to a different place, a different perspective on the story. So, so there again, you know, not, she was a younger demographic too, but the idea generally is bring people across, stress the nuance, and hope that the lens applies kind of no matter where they are.
Thank you. What do you call that graph?
It's we call it the why we wrote this.
Great, thank you.
And do you find, like, is audio a good place to, you know, to reach the younger audience for you? I mean, is it something that you're really trying to do? And is...
Yeah, I mean, I think the appeal to audio for us is that it removes the distance between, I mean, good writing can do this too, but the power of audio to put someone in the story and, you know, to have them hearing, you know, to use the Tulsa example again, when you hear someone's voice crack in audio, it's a much more relatable moment in journalism. So, you know, we haven't specifically, I mean, we're not using it to target young audiences necessarily. It's more so to just find a more effective way to present monitor journalism. But that is kind of an approach we hope will lift all boats in terms of audiences.
Okay, I must say I'm just quite struck by, Mark, what you said, like that you feel like that it's impossible to reach, you know, both audiences. There's a couple more questions in here. Okay, so Azza Hazret from South Caucasus and Central Asia asks, how do you cover these regions? And are your coverages frequent? As he understands, you don't have permanent representatives in the region.
Yeah, I can address that a little bit. I was the international editor for many years. We have a correspondent named Fred Weir, based in Moscow. He has actually lived in Moscow since 1986, so he's really deeply versed in the region, and he has long been our point person for traveling in Central Asia around the, you know, when he started the Soviet Union and now Russia, of course. So that's how we handle it. It as much as we would like. No, it's not. But Fred is very well connected and well versed in a lot of the history and a lot of the news there. And so, as is possible, he has traveled there. One story, it's the North Caucasus, but you know, one thing the Monitor does try to do is follow up on stories that have kind of fallen out of the news, or not in saying, you know, things that were headline news for a long time. Well, what's happened? Where have things gone? And this was probably a couple of years ago now, but he went back to Chechnya and traveled through much of the area, which a lot of people, I think, you know, obviously associate with a lot of devastation, and talked about the political world there, I guess, and also showed, you know, very different image than many people who might have not been following that story for the past, you know, couple of decades would be familiar with. So we do our best. Obviously, things have been on serious hold over the past year plus, but that's how we cover that region. It's kind of when Fred sees an opportunity or there's good news reason to go to countries in that region, he will be our point person. Occasionally, we've been able to find freelancers, but it's pretty hard, frankly, in that area. So. So Jackie, you're muted again.
I just muted myself. Okay, Molly, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. I was just sort of struck at the comment that somebody made at the beginning about sort of avoiding, I'm not sure if the term was social media drama or churn or whatever. And I was just wondering kind of how do you guys avoid sort of getting caught up in that kind of stuff and keeping your focus on the things that the Christian Science Monitor is known for, this sort of like kind of sensationalist journalism?
And Molly, where are you coming to us from?
I'm from the US originally, but I am a journalist that's based in the Netherlands.
Great.
I think our church's financial backing is essential to that. We couldn't do it without that. I remember I was in a media workshop class a year or two ago, and there was a gentleman who had been one of the kind of founding members of Politico. If you know what that is, it's a political website in the United States. It's very popular now, has basically become, you know, the inside Washington's go-to publication. But his passion was issues of poverty, and he wanted to write about poverty. He'd grown up in eastern Kentucky, which is one of the most impoverished areas of the United States, and he just saw the effect that poverty had on people, and kind of in this same kind of mission sort of way wanted to do a story. He wanted to focus his journalism on poverty. The fact is, to be completely blunt, no one really wants to read about poverty. And so he was having a lot of trouble finding funding. And I remember at one point during our class, he said that he had secured a $100,000 grant from Microsoft, which for him was a game changer. But, you know, for us with 50 people on staff, you know, $100,000 probably goes in a day and a half. So, you know, having the church's backing to be able to make those decisions where we can focus on a mission lens as opposed to that profit motive, we couldn't do it without it. And I think it was Amelia who said at the beginning that we were given a founding directive by our founder, by Mary Baker Eddy. And so obviously the church is very much behind that and sees that as essential to the mission, because we do have that relationship of, you know, being founded by the founder of the church too. So while the two missions aren't exactly the same, I mean, the Monitor's job, if you read it, is clearly not to convert people to Christian Science. Its healing mission in the world is very seen as being integral to the church's mission. We just do it in a different way than, you know, the church itself would do.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that point, I think, you know, this doesn't go to quite the social media drama thing, but it is what drives, I think, the Monitor. We have this sort of way of saying it around the newsroom, which is being called Dare to See the World Differently. And a lot of the media focus on a certain narrative. We all know that. You know, the New York Times just said one of their morning newsletters recently was on just bad news is what draws people. It is an easy sell. And so we are stubbornly trying to go in the other direction, or we have always been going in the other direction because of that feeling that the world is actually, as we all know it, it's complex. It's not all bad news. There is even despite all the trials that face different countries and, you know, communities and so forth and so on, there is a steady march toward innovation, breakthroughs on all sorts of fronts, progress. And so trying to help people see that more complex world is really what we try to do. And that's, I guess it connects to me on social media, related to the social media question, in the sense that we just really need to get out there and keep saying that over and over again in a way that doesn't sound like we're trying to be sugarcoat anything or, you know, be Pollyannish about it. But, that there is a fairly it's forward-looking approach at the Monitor that is a little bit daring, I think, in many ways, to say that part of the narrative as important as anything else, and communicating that. And then, you know, once you get people to see that, they often will stick around. But it's, you know, it's obviously a big challenge. We're not a large circulation outfit, so it's an ongoing battle.
So a couple of quick questions following up from Emre, and Emre's with our IPI National Committee in Turkey. So I'll just read them though, because we're running out of time. So he said the deep read default, what's the percentage of users who click quick read? And secondly, what's the percentage of users who hit the 3 stories per month limit in your metered model in a given month?
I can take the first of those, and then I think the second would be Dave on the meter. Yeah, I think almost no one in the SEO article version that's found in the wild online. The default is for it to be open, and I suspect almost no one from there clicks the short read. I'm not sure we have analytics on that, but going the other direction, I mean that toggle, the short read is really designed with the daily subscriber in mind, and what they get at 6:15 East Coast US time every night is an email that's basically a static replica of the non-expanded daily. So we have our open rates on the email to look at, and then within that, a lot of people frankly just use the email and the minis, as we call them, as their daily, and that's fine with us. I mean, subscribers can use this in any way they want. If they click on any of the components in the email, it takes them to the web-based daily, which is obviously more interactive there. And I'm not actually sure at that point what the expand rate is, but we were a little surprised early on how many people were satisfied with the mini. We try to write those in ways that sort of do include the whole story arc, and it's not just the lead of the story and expand to read the rest. We try to write it so that it is a satisfying, if abbreviated read, but that is a challenge to figure out when that should be okay, and when you want people to read the whole narrative arc. Dave, on the meter tripping, I'm not sure what that number.
Yeah, I mean, I think less than 5% of our visitors actually trip the meter, and we generate maybe 50 subscriptions, 70 subscriptions a month from the meter. It's not a huge number. We used to have the meter at 5 stories, and we found it was actually far more effective in generating subscriptions by bringing it down to 3, and we've played with even less than that, as other companies have found as well. So I don't know if that gets at what your question is, but it's not a huge driver.
Okay, and I was having a look today. I was pretty impressed with the short versions of your stories, because as we know, it's harder often to write that with that kind of brevity. So Bill, I think, has the last question.
Thank you. I was interested, Mark, in your discussion of the financial support of the church. How do you wrestle with the challenge when on occasion you need to cover the church? How do you position yourself in terms of journalistic independence when you're covering an institution that helps support you?
I think I can imagine that would be a much greater issue with you all, in the sense that people don't turn to the Monitor for coverage of the Christian Science Church. Obviously, the Catholic Church is a newsmaker, and so there's, if I imagine any publication, and certainly your publication, would have to turn a lens on the Catholic Church. We really are focused on the world, and if something happens with Christian Science that was of that level of interest, I think we'd have to deal with that. That's never happened in my editorship. The Christian Science Church has never done anything that was newsworthy in that way. And we don't look at ourselves as being the newspaper of Christian scientists following the Christian Science Church. So it just really has never come up. I would imagine that during the 1980s, there were certain lawsuits that were against the church over child abuse and things like that, in the sense of relying on prayer for healing, and the child died, and then there was a question of, is that child abuse or is that religious freedom? That might have been something that, if I was editor at that time, we really would have had to go to wrestle with. How do we cover this? Because that was a news item. But there's really been nothing that's happened during my tenure that has been newsworthy. So I to be honest, I haven't had to wrestle with it yet. But I imagine in your position, that's a really interesting idea to go through. You're not are you connected with the Catholic Church in any way, or are you completely independent?
We're completely independent, and periodically various bishops argue that we should remove the word Catholic from our masthead. But
Right.
but it is an issue that arises. But by the way, I'm based in Boston and look forward to following up with you in person. I'm a long time admirer of the Monitor.
Right.
Beginning, go ahead.
My sense is that if I were in your shoes, the way I would think about it would be is what is our audience and who are we serving? And I mean, you very clearly laid out, you know, the people who are the kind of the activists in the 1960s. Obviously, you're going to want to think about that broader in terms of among young Catholics, among young people interested in the Catholic Church, what is our audience? But I would kind of say, who is our audience and what do we want to deliver for them? And I would let that guide my coverage of the Catholic Church because I mean, as you know, there's a million and one different ways to cover the Catholic Church, and you know, there's so many different you know, approaches to the Catholic Church for, you know, on the spectrum from liberal to conservative. And I think you kind of need to figure out what is our niche and what is our approach, and that guides you in how you cover the church. Would be my guess.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. I think we can slip in one more question. Everett Dennis has been wanting to ask a question. Everett? You need to turn your mic on. You're on mute.
There we go. Okay, thanks very much. I'm Ev Dennis, and I'm at the Medill School of Journalism, where I'm a professor, but most recently been in Qatar for 9 years. I'm there, great admiration for the Monitor, and many thanks to IPI for arranging this session today. My question is essentially, how do you try to maintain a global voice when most stories are either local or national? And then secondly, I visited the Monitor offices long ago when Kay Fanning was editor. I remember at that time writing about the Monitor, having the mantra of problem solution journalism. I noticed today there's a whole movement in solution journalism. I wondered first on the global question, and then on the second one, do you see yourselves as part of the solution journalism movement? Thank you.
I'd say, Amelia, if you could take that first question. Amelia, as a longtime international editor, has just been, and obviously connected with IPI, has just been an amazing advocate for the power and necessity of international coverage in the Monitor's mission. So I would say that'd be great if you could weigh in on that.
Sure. Yeah, and you're about how do we keep that international perspective? It's well, one thing we've sometimes battled mightily to keep our foreign bureaus open. We don't have as big a footprint internationally as we used to, but we're still pretty good, especially given the size and budget that we have. So I would say there's a deep commitment to international news, and the key things that we try to focus on. I mean, because we are trying to cover the world, and I think that the way we try to look at it, and I'd be the first to say we don't always succeed, is we're not trying to be an American newspaper covering all those countries out there. We are trying to think, what are the important stories for people in various regions? And you know, if you look at a lot of American international coverage, or at least quite a bit of it, it's done from an American interest point of view. And that's something we try to pull ourselves out of and try to help people see, well, if you're an American sitting in X state, you might see it this way, but here's how people in Russia or in Turkey or in Nigeria see what's going on here, or, you know, that you get the perspectives from the local places, you know, other than the United States, obviously. So I think there's a pretty deep commitment. It goes to, I mean, I suppose you could also say that the Christian Science Church is an international church, so that affects things as well, but that it is a, you know, if you want to put it a little bit poetically, it's a global family of men, right? It's not just Americans and how they see the world. So that's something we really try to work on. And I will say, as somebody who had to watch some bureaus close and then managed to reopen a couple of them in recent years, I've seen that we are, you know, maybe for a little while it wasn't quite where we wanted it to be, but there's that ongoing commitment to, can we reopen this bureau? Can we add a person here? And so we're fairly unified around that.
One thing I would add that Amelia is probably too modest to add is that ultimately I think it's fair to say that international bureaus lose us money. You know, they cost a lot of money and they don't bring back in readership. So it is a mission thing. And so that's why we've seen so many American newspapers just abandoning their bureaus, is because of that profit motive. But one of the first things that I did when I came back is I reopened the Africa Bureau because of that exact thing that Amelia is saying. This paper is not just about Americans; it's about humanity, and there's incredibly important stories to tell about that from Africa. But what Amelia has done that I think has allowed us to keep a larger global footprint despite those economics is that she's really kind of pioneered flexible ways in which we can have relationships with people. So it's not actually a bureau, but it is something where we have a really deep relationship with someone. She mentioned our Russia correspondent, Fred Weir, who's a perfect example of that. We have someone in Jordan who is doing that. We have someone in Mexico City. So even though we only have, 5 or 6 actual staff bureaus, our footprint is probably more on the order of 12 or so, where we're getting really good coverage from all these different areas. And I think her ability to think flexibly about this, I think, has been an example of how you have to think if you're trying to make a global footprint work in this moment. Because if you have to pay full freight for 15 people, you're just going to drive your organization to the ground economically. You have to think more flexibly about that. And I think that's something that we've really added in the past, 5 to 10 to 15 years, is that flexibility. And you had a second question too, Everett. I'm sorry. We were so excited about the first one.
Well, the second question is about so-called solutions journalism.
Oh, yeah.
Probably solution journalism, which is invented at the Monitor, but I noticed the current solutions journalism movement doesn't seem to mention that. I've mentioned it to them, by the way.
Yes, we have too. We do have a relationship. There is a solutions journalism network, and we have had relationship with them, and we have had events with them, and we have a good relationship with them. But we do try and say we've been doing solutions journalism for 110 years, because I think that's true. Ultimately, though, it's like we have to live and die on our own demonstration of it. So, we love that solutions journalism is doing that. In some ways, I feel like the Monitor is meant to be a pioneer for these things. And then as other media people, learn and that these things are sustainable, then we can move on to the next thing. But yeah, I would just say, yes, I feel like we have been doing solutions journalism for decades. And I feel like there's a natural support that we can give to that movement and they can give to us that should be mutually beneficial.
Okay, look, we're kind of running out of time. We'll take one last question if you're all okay about hanging around. It's a great discussion, if you don't mind. Wangeti, your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Wangeti Mwangi. I am in Nairobi, Kenya. It's a very quick question for me. Given that you are a not-for-profit organization, does the issue of content monetization bother you at all? Is it of strategic importance to you? So just that.
Yes, because although we have good financial backing from the church, we also want to be relevant. It doesn't make sense if we just have the church pay our bills and then we just see subscriptions dwindle and engagement dwindle. We're looking for all the different ways that we can say that we're having an impact. And it doesn't always have to be just on, clicks or subscriptions. I mean, you can have an impact in lots of ways, but at the same time, you have to have readers. And so to me, the Monitor is, I hope, at the forefront of, again, thinking about how those two things combined. How can you do, journalism of conscience and journalism that drives the world forward and get engagement? It's like you need both. And we are daily struggling to figure out how best to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, great, and great question. So we're experimenting, of course, with this as well, and we had set 75 minutes, as the kind of the time frame for the meeting, but maybe actually an hour and a half is more what we need for future newsroom visits. Are there any kind of closing comments from anyone, from our hosts, or any of you indeed?
Yeah, I would just say what I find from meetings like this is a common cause. We talk about common humanity at the Monitor, but you know, we're all in this in our own ways for our journalism to do good and to lift societies and to move things forward. And, you know, just looking forward to when things get back a little normal, having Bill come into the newsroom, which is a nice, easy visit. But I think we're always interested in continuing relationships. And I think we'd all love to, you know, if there's any way that we can help or any ways that there can be a kind of collaborative relationship, we're always eager to kind of continue these relationships. So there's just a nice, these kind of events are a nice way of us all connecting and recognizing kind of the unity of what we do.
Yeah, I would heartily second that and just say, you know, it's very grateful to the IPI for doing this, and so many, I've made so many international connections through being involved with the IPI over the years. And yeah, we just hope everybody will reach out to us. We'll reach out to you. And yeah, once we're all moving around again, maybe we can all visit in situ, which would be great.
Christoph?
I was just clapping for you for reaching out internationally. I guess it's very important for all of us, and I'm really grateful that you share the experience, because like in the end, like we all as journalists are in kind of similar situations. Situations might differ somehow, but the general situation is very similar. And I'm also grateful to IPI for organizing this, because this is a great opportunity to find out more about this and learn from each other. So I'm grateful. Thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah, okay, so we'll close it now. And just to close, I'd like to, I guess, you know, reinforce what Mark said. I think what's been so lovely about this conversation is that it's really been driven by the journalism and the mission of journalism. And of course, you know, how do we make it all work online, you know, you know, through the audience experiments and innovation is all in service of the journalism. So I'm just going to put my email address in the box, and I'd love to hear back from any of you, any ideas that you have or any feedback. We love feedback. And I mean, if everybody is happy, then we can share everybody's email addresses among this group. You know, if you want to opt out, just let me know, or let Melissa know. And yeah, let us know that we have your permission. And yeah, thank you very much to our hosts, to Amelia, to Mark, to Dave and Clay. It's been great hearing your stories. And thank you, everybody